I am asked to introduce Mr. Gopakumar Nair. He is going to be the moderator with Veena Johri for this webinar. Gopakumar is trained as a lawyer with specialization in international law. He is legal advisor to Third World Network. TWN is an independent not-for-profit organization that carries out policy research and advocacy on issues around trade and development with a focus on third world countries. If I'm not mistaken, Gopa has also done a law degree on intellectual property rights from Stockholm.
Yeah, thank you, Chinu. Thank you, the organizers, for organizing this series of webinars on vaccines, different aspects of vaccine. As Chinu told you already, today we will focus on the ownership and access issues related to the vaccine. As we speak, the clinical trials results are trickling in, and there is more hope towards reaching a vaccine, and that will supposed to enhances our effectiveness of fight against the COVID-19. But at the same time, while the results of clinical trial results are coming in, the concerns related to access also growing. As you might be knowing that the 13% of the population who live in advanced countries have already advance booked around more than 50%, around 52% of the vaccine to be produced by the end of 2021. So this raises a great concern related to the vast majority of the people who will be left out if the status quo continues. While the results are coming in and there is a hope, at the same time the concerns also growing. Against that background, we are organizing this webinar series to demystify some of the issues, and also I'm sure the speakers will also tell us what's the way forward. So we have three speakers. They will focus on three important aspects of the access and ownership debate. The first issue is looking at vaccine as a public good, why we need to look at it as a public good. Hitherto, the vaccines were looked at as even though it's a medical product, it is treated by and large legally and economically as a commercial good. But at the same time, we know that we need availability at an affordable price, and there is a huge demand. So one producer or two producers are not in a position to produce these vaccines and meet the demand. Therefore, we need to reconceptualize the whole idea of a commercial good into a public good. So one of our speakers, the first speaker, is going to focus on that issue, and at the second speaker is going to look at the main tool to control the ownership or assert the ownership on vaccines, mainly using the intellectual property tools, and including patents, trade secrets, etc. So the second speaker will focus on that, and the last speaker will focus. There are three main initiatives internationally to ensure what they call it fair and equitable access to the COVID medical tools, including vaccines. And these initiatives are, one is ACT, that is the main initiative to develop these products. And there is a CTAP initiative, which is to have a pooling of all the technologies related to COVID, including vaccines. But now the news says that vaccines are out of CTAP. And then there is another mechanism. The third mechanism is the COVAX, which is supposed to procure and deliver these vaccines. So Rohit, the third speaker, is going to tell us on that aspect of the issue. So let me invite the first speaker is Professor T. Sundararaman. He is currently the global coordinator of People's Health Movement and has been an activist of people's science and people health movement since the 80s. He worked 18 years in the Faculty of Internal Medicine at JIPMER in Pondicherry. From 2002, he shifted to working the strengthening of public health system, first at the Director of State Health Resource Center, Chhattisgarh, and then as an Executive Director of National Health System Resource Center. Later, teaching a few years at TIS. his main contributions in his stint in Chhattisgarh as well as NHRC is the developing community health workers programs like ASHA and different aspects of strengthening public health system. So let me invite Professor Sundar Raman to make his presentation, and his topic, let me repeat it again, vaccines as public good, the notion of public good in the framework of universal healthcare.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's curious that sometime in late April, early May, suddenly there was a lot of interest in this term and it drew a lot of traction. And this term had not been used so widely before. It started with the UN Secretary General declaring that all the tools required to control will be treated as global public good, and recognizes, and then the World Health Assembly resolution, there was quite a debate on that. First had said the role of vaccines, and then it was modified to the role of extensive immunization as a global public health good for transmission. And it was followed through by, curiously, a number of statements of world leaders, ranging from the French to the Chinese, the WHO chief. And there was an awakening of the discourse about what public goods are and what does it mean when they say global public goods. And there were a lot of meanings being made of what different people meant by public goods and what were they promising, because when they said that. And therefore, I thought it would be useful to sort of go back on this literature and see what it really means. Now, this is an old term in classical economics and goes back to the very foundations with Adam Smith. We're talking of the three key functions of any government. One is, of course, defense and national security. One was legislation, judiciary. But the third is the provisioning of public goods. And in this reasoning, there are certain goods or services which markets cannot provide, where markets fail, where competition and choice cannot take place and prices can't be set. In such areas of provisioning, it becomes the key. Now, traditionally, this was limited to an understanding of non-excludable, non-rivalrous goods and goods with high degrees of externality, which meant, for example, in vector control, if we are able to clear a particular urban area from mosquitoes, even those who don't pay the house tax will be able to get the benefits of it. And if more people come in, they will also be able to get the benefits of it. The consumption by some does not reduce for others. And therefore, such goods cannot be actually put onto the market. It is for the government to provide these. But there are other goods, like classically in the treatment of tuberculosis. You can price a treatment for tuberculosis. You can exclude people from treatment for tuberculosis. We do it all the time. And when you exclude, for every person who is excluded from treatment, it's likely that 10 more people will get infected with tuberculosis. So the price of treating tuberculosis does not include the price of saving 10 others from getting tuberculosis. And again, in such an area, there is a major need for governments to invest. And this is one of the major areas. So with this old understanding, however, healthcare services, especially medical curative care services, could be very much a market commodity, a commodity on the market. But right from the Keynesian period, but very classically captured in Kenneth Arrow's seminal paper, pointed out that actually medical services are also not possible to work on the market. For one thing, this is a product like no other. When you purchase, you go to a doctor and while getting a treatment for cancer or for COVID-19, there is no way he can guarantee the outcome. And you may die in spite of the fact that you've been well treated or survived despite poor treatment on that. People can't make an informed choice. At some point, we have to have high levels of trust in the provider. And the provider's incentive is not necessarily what the client's incentive is. They are misaligned. Normally, you expect in classical economics, the market to align these incentives. They don't align these incentives. And you may need a normal delivery. You may need actually a medical treatment, but they can enforce a surgical treatment on that. And there is a misalignment because the returns for the provider are much more there. And finally, the nature of the medical profession itself. So in some sense, it was not just those which are excludable and rivalrous, but all of healthcare services where the government had a necessary role. And if you look at, therefore, the old Adam Smith definition of where governments are required to provide it, this becomes the whole of healthcare. And this was really the rationale of post-war industrialized world to opt for universal healthcare systems, except the United States, whether it's the Japanese, the Australians, the Canadians, the Europeans, the Scandinavians, all of them have actually adopted universal care systems because these were understood as the responsibility of the government. For socialist countries, it was a different foundational principle on that. And even in India and the developing world, at the level of a policy commitment, if you see the Bore Committee report, its preamble, the very first line is that no individual would be denied an adequate level of medical care because of inability to pay for it. So at some point, the role of the government in that sense becomes a predominant role on that. But this was to change with the whole of classical economics gives way to neoclassical economics. In the first phase of reforms, the definition of public health is pulled back into its non-excludable, non-rivalrous, limited areas with an active recommendation that all the other services should actually be pushed into the private sector so that the government is limited into it. Similarly, even in intellectual property, in rights, it was the play of the markets that has to be permitted across the board and not really in terms of public services and what was the public requirements that informed the earlier period on that. One important thing to note, because that is why we are saying it reawakened. Where did this disappear? It was disappeared first in the first phase, but in the second phase of reforms, we are suddenly saying you can't leave it to the markets. Actually, governments have to play a role. And it is not governments to be limited to a very selective package, but the governments must actually work across the entire package of services and the notion of universal health coverage as different from the first phase, which was all about very selective packages. And this making markets work through insurance schemes or now increasingly the term strategic purchasing is ways of restoring competition, choice, indicating prices, addressing inequity. Now, this framework is dismissive of the difference between public provision and private providers. It's just a question of purchasing and financing. It doesn't really matter in this framework whether you purchase it from a public provider or a private provider. It's an inherently problematic definitional change, but if you accept that, there are consequences on that. And then it also, therefore, looks in the second phase, we are talking, as we can see this in COVID-19, public financing, support of innovation in a major way. There was an earlier period when we were talking of it as a public good. But then in the market logic, you are talking of it as a private commercial product. If AstraZeneca or Moderna or Pfizer are getting into it, they are getting huge government funding. But they are marketing it as a commercial product. And this is a particular difference in the way in which you are treating and a term that was not sanctified by global public good. So therefore, the surprise that COVID-19 actually brings back this particular logic. Now, COVID-19 pandemic creates a crisis. We know the crisis it has created in health. We know the crisis it has created in livelihoods and in the economy. But it is also a challenge to the whole dominant discourse that is there around the market-based reforms. The inability of reforms to address the pandemic, the whole trend, we are not talking of actually whether the reforms were successful, but the whole trend, the ideological trend, is actually under challenge because there is a negligible contribution from private sector in both primary care hospitalization. There's a falling back to public hospitals and public health teams in primary care. There is an inability to maintain essential health services. There is a disruption of global supply chains, a sudden recognition of the importance of domestic manufacture. I remember one time in the ministry, we were this whole argument about brownfield and greenfield hospitals. They were poo-pooing our objection, saying, what? Why do you think all of them will suddenly stop supplying to you because of your thing? And here you have had a huge disruption of global supply chains and the failure of timely innovation and introduction of new products. As of now, in terms of curative medicines, it's a dud. the whole process of innovation hasn't led to it. So there is this whole need to reverse market-based reforms and reassert the role of the government in both the production of healthcare services and healthcare products, areas which were classically till then understood to be commodities where markets may be at best shaped but not at some point treated as public goods. So it is in some sense an important reversal, and we need to actually understand what it means. So what do we mean then as vaccine as a global public good? It means that the government has a responsibility and accountability for ensuring innovation through public financing, through promoting the sharing of knowledge, regulation, making sure that it is safe and effective, manufacture on a scale of technology transfer, domestic production, scaling up manufacture in a major way, global and local supply chains, the whole area of it, government can't leave it to actual corporate market development. There is a conscious intervention, and the delivery of the vaccine, free, affordable vaccine. If that is the implication, you have a whole issue of costs, prices, what is public expenditure, what are delivery mechanisms, what are health systems that will deliver it, and what is the concerns of equity and ethical prioritization. So a global public good as an announcement that some cheap vaccine becomes available on the market is really a very insufficient and incomplete understanding. What it really means is a much larger government intervention. Now, let us look, because a lot has been said about the innovation of new drugs and the manufacture. Let me start from the reverse. Look at it from the system's point of vaccine delivery. Now, there are some problems, challenges of vaccine delivery that are vaccine related. The Pfizer vaccine, for example, needs a minus 70 degree cold chain. It is almost impossible to organize outside research laboratories today, and we don't really build on that. Of course, Moderna claims minus 20 and even refrigerator for a month. But still, this is one issue of the cold chain. 2 or more doses are required, and we know, for example, the dropouts between doses, the of managing 2 doses. And even at very low adverse event rates, given the numbers being immunized, you are going to have a large requirement for looking at identification, compensation, management, which requires a huge and elaborate surveillance to support it. And finally, we know very little about these current vaccines. We don't know that they will prevent infection, meaning spread of infection to others from those who are immunized. It's an assumption that can be wrong. We don't know that they are improving mortality as yet. We don't know that they will prevent transmission. Prevent infection, meaning infection coming into the person. Prevent transmission is a separate issue. We don't know the duration of protection. We are going to require massive post-introduction surveillance. Remember, something like rotavirus took 10 years to the introduction. Over here, we will need a massive post-introduction surveillance, which is again something that needed. And then there is the whole question of antibody. Are you going to immunize everybody when there are 30 to 70% already got natural immunity through past infection? Is some of the issues that we will need to look at. There is another set of host of issues that are systems related. Current immunization rates for even measles and for full immunization is at 50 to 80% in many states. So how are you actually going to go for immunizing the entire population? This is only one small percentage of the population, less than 3%. And how are you going to immunize the whole population? Huge expansion of infrastructure that is required, a huge expansion of human resources and financial resources. There was one article that says Moderna is costing its vaccine at about 2,500 rupees per dose, which is about 5,000 rupees. Our entire state expenditure and central expenditure on vaccine is 1,100. If we spend anything from 2,000 to 4,000 to purchase this, how are we actually going to be able to think? So there's a huge expenditure that is required. And the danger is, even if in a token way, we introduce this in a haphazard way or in a token way or to some section of the population, without the necessary increase in infrastructure, HR and expenditure, we will actually undermine health services. And if you look at cost effectiveness of such population-based interventions, they are going to be extraordinarily low. Now, I'm not got the time to go into it, a very tacit thing that we can use the private sector to close the gaps in vaccine delivery. There are many reasons why you can't, though it seems such an apparent answer, but I go into that. It's not only where the private sector is. So in sort of partial conclusion, one cannot have vaccines as a global public good unless vaccination is a global public good. And you can't have vaccination as a public good unless the organization of health services required for delivery are also perceived as a global public good. And in the absence of a larger commitment to universal health care, a one-time round COVID-19 immunization could create more problems than it would solve. This same problem affects the availability of vaccines. I have just one more slide. The perception is that India has no problems in vaccines because we have 4 or more firms, but we don't know the agreements. We don't know the prices that are being set, the volumes that are promised, the supply schedule. And there is a high reliance on COVAX. Now, I'm not going to COVAX. I found that Malpani is going to it. But the point that I'm trying to make is that COVAX is yet another making the markets work type of solution. Therefore, it's not just a question of finding the funds and being able to subsidize, purchase. You let production take place as it is take place. You intervene only in the demand side in the purchasing mechanism. Thereby, you intervene least in the market. That's the underlying logic. And we will find that the COVAX logic has serious problems in the way, and I've listed this, and I think the others will go. I've given some introduction to it. I think the others will cover this. It requires actually a rethink of what a public good means, even in the manufacture and production of vaccines. Innovation means to be recognized as a public good, which is both public financing and domestic innovation, IP barriers, and even innovation to reduce costs, to reduce the toughness of the vaccine to face environmental conditions in India. So in some sense, you have to actually have a continuing innovation program. It's not that Moderna has developed a vaccine and now we can go with it. We will need to have iterations of vaccines. Scaling up manufacture requires it. And it is a very different logic when you do it for a public good, as different from a commercial commodity. You have an export-import for public goods without IP, without voluntary licensing barriers, and eventually the whole of public procurement and distribution systems, which are required to actually reach the vaccine where they are needed most. So in some sense, what we are saying is this statement of a global public good looks very good, and in fact is very good. I think it is a statement that we should hold the government and we should hold these people accountable for. But it does not stop with just some manufacture of a vaccine and being available in the market in sufficient quantities. It requires a whole way of thinking, not only about purchasing agreements, but the organization in which the production of the vaccine takes place and the delivery of vaccination and immunization takes place as part of an overall healthcare plan on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sundar. So let me now invite Kajal Bharadwaj. Kajal Bharadwaj is trained as a lawyer and based in Delhi. She is working on HIV, health and human rights issues, with especially focusing on the trade and IP and access issues. So Kajal is going to explain to us the vaccines and intellectual property, and the title of the presentation is Vaccines and Intellectual Property Should Be Concerned.
Thank you so much for the invitation for this webinar, but more importantly, I think thank you for organizing this webinar series. I think a lot of us who've been working and have been furious for the last 9 months to see not just business as usual, but worse than business as usual going on in the pandemic, have been wanting to have this sort of brainstorming and discussion around the various issues that are going to impact us. And of course, vaccines is top of everyone's mind as hopefully the technological solution or the scientific solution out of the pandemic. Let's see and let's hope, but I think there's a bunch of issues to look at. And from Sundar's really excellent presentation looking at the broader issue of a public good, mine is just going to get a little more narrow into looking at one of the issues where the issue of public good gets complicated by private rights and private intellectual property. So my job today was to look at COVID-19 vaccines and IP and to wonder whether we should be concerned. A full disclosure, my main area of work is on access to medicine. So like all of you, I think I'm also learning more and more about what IP for vaccines would look like. And what I've tried to do in this presentation is just put together some of my research and learning and hopefully understand from all of you also how to analyze this. So just going back to the what we would now refer to as the pre-COVID era, it's so odd to say that because that was just last year. But there has been an increasing concern about intellectual property and particularly patenting of vaccines over the last 10 or 15 years. There's sort of two trains of thought on this. There is a traditional narrative that says that this is actually something that we should not be concerned about. It doesn't actually impact too much when you talk about vaccines and access. And then there is a lot of growing concern from public health activists, from access to medicines and health technologies groups saying that actually we need to start looking at this. So I'm starting off with a report that WIPO had put out in 2008, and my apologies to those who severely criticize WIPO for their work for starting with this. But they actually looked at a bunch of infectious diseases and tried to do a patent landscape of how many patents there were on this. And they looked at patent families claiming active ingredients of vaccines and found at the time that there were over 11,000 patent families and over 51,000 patents and patent applications. They then also looked at the pneumococcal vaccine, the typhoid vaccine, and the human influenza vaccines, and similarly found that actually there was considerable vaccine patenting activity going on, and it had increased considerably. Particularly, you see that increase happening 2004 onwards. So this report actually highlighted this increase. In 2004, there was a really interesting meeting that the WHO put together looking at IP rights and vaccines in developing countries. And I think part of the reason for this, for most of you, you'd remember, is that 2004 was the year before India, which is also one of the largest medicines and vaccines producers, was going to comply with the TRIPS agreement and start granting patents. I would encourage all of you to look at the report and the presentations at this meeting. It's actually quite an eye-opener even now. But what was interesting was at that time, you have the developing countries vaccine manufacturers network already starting to express concern, saying that we don't actually understand how this is going to impact our work. We've already heard that there are patents that are being granted for the manufacture of combination vaccines. To us, this adjuvant has been used for several decades, so we don't understand how it can be patented. Similarly, cross-flow filtration for concentration for the manufacturing of vaccines has got patented. And we don't know what to expect and what world to see after 2005 in terms of how we can produce and deliver vaccines. At the same time, 2005 onwards, you start seeing a concern increasing that despite there's an increase in vaccine patent activity, you have the TRIPS agreement that is now mostly applicable in developing countries. So the multinational pharmaceutical industry and its incentive that it requires to work on health technologies is actually leaving the vaccine field. And you see this happen progressively. And by 2014, there was this big announcement where Novartis, which was a big vaccine producer, actually sold off its vaccine business to GSK. And there was increasing concern over the last few years that the number of producers of vaccines has actually gone down massively. So on the one hand, you have the incentives, the IP system increasing and reaching a global reach. And on the other hand, you see the industry actually backing away from this. And a lot of discussion went into how the markets were too small, the prices for vaccines that they could earn were too small, and they were actually moving away from that. Issues around IP and vaccines also flared up when during the H5N1 outbreak, where Indonesia said that they would no longer share virus samples because these were being shared by the WHO with private commercial entities who were then patenting the work that was coming out of that and then charging too much for vaccines. That took several years of negotiation then to resolve at the WHO. And in 2016, the UN High-Level Panel on Access to Medicines actually noted that where there have been emerging infectious disease outbreaks, and they were really talking about the need to de-link the system of intellectual property and pricing and what goes into R&D and from the pricing of the product. They looked at what happened with Zika and with Ebola, saying that despite these outbreaks, because there was no idea that it was actually going to spread, it was going to go beyond borders, that research and development that was actually existing, a lot of basic research existed, was just sitting on the shelves. So for instance, there were no vaccines that were developed, and there was a promising Ebola therapy and actually a vaccine that languished in preclinical R&D for over 10 years without funding because Big Pharma just did not see the reason to invest in this. So in fact, there were questions already happening about the fact that there was increasing vaccine patenting activity going on, yet you see the industry moving out. And then when there have been outbreaks previously, let's not forget that there have been for the last 10 years, you see an absolute failure of the R&D system and the IP system to deliver. So in terms of impact on pricing and access, like I said, there's this long entrenched view that patents do not create barriers in terms of access or pricing of vaccines. And the hepatitis B vaccines are used as an example of this, to say that when there were plasma-derived vaccines and there were no patents, you had competition and the prices came down. But then when you had the rDNA vaccines and there was patents and no competition, even that led to a price reduction. And this example is often quoted to say, actually, it's not pricing and it's not patents that caused the problem in pricing and access for vaccines. But actually what a lot of people miss is that in putting out the hepatitis B vaccines, both Merck and SmithKline Beecham actually needed licenses to more than 90 patents from universities, public institutes, and private companies to actually produce those vaccines. So in fact, it is actually quite a complicated patent landscape when you start looking at how vaccines are produced and how they are supplied. There are these two fantastic reports in 2017 that came out, literally a few months apart. And what you see over here are two wildly differing opinions on whether patents actually impact prices and availability of vaccines. So you have the MSF report that talked about a fair shot for vaccine affordability. And then you have a WIPO report looking at vaccines and accelerating innovation. And as can be expected, the WIPO report simply says, look, the IP is necessary to keep the industry interested in vaccine development. It's not causing a problem in access. Actually, it relates to know-how, manufacturing processes, lack of human resources, which is, of course, something, if you worked in access to medicines, you've always heard this, that patents and prices are not the problem. It's human resources, it's government funding, it's health infrastructure that's the problem. The MSF report actually was quite fascinating, and it was able to show actually the extent to which patenting is happening in vaccines. And what they found was patenting of starting materials, of vaccine compositions, of process technologies, and methods of use. And if you're familiar with the problem of evergreening in medicines, what you're actually seeing over here is a similar sort of attempt being made where initial vaccine patents are extremely broad. And then you see follow-on patents that would extend the time period that, you know, a company or a university would have control or exclusivity over that particular vaccine. Which would include methods of use. It would include, for instance, using a patented vaccine in different age groups, in how it would be delivered, mechanisms of delivery. We're talking about nasal vaccines now, and each of those would get patented. So that was just to give you an idea of what happened before 2020. And that brings us to 2020, COVID-19 vaccine race, as it's being called. Is it a race to save lives, or is it a race for blockbuster profits? I guess it depends on where you are on the cynical spectrum to answer that question. But just to give you an idea of what is going on with the patent, with the vaccine patents for COVID-19, the reality is we will not know what that landscape really looks like until next year. Because when patent applications are filed, they're typically published 18 months later. So by the middle of next year, we'll really see what kind of patent applications have come in. But we've already seen, as we've seen in the previous reports, that there has been a lot of vaccine patenting activity in any case, and on coronaviruses generally. So the European Patent Office has this interesting sort of page where they're keeping track of all the coronavirus technology patents and set up data sets for it. And for vaccines against coronaviruses, they've actually done searches for live attenuated and inactivated vaccines, virus-like particles, viral vectors as vaccines, nucleic acid-based vaccines, antigen-presenting cells, adjuvanted vaccines, nanoparticles, and administration routes. So they did a search for looking at all coronavirus vaccine-related patent applications and patents. And this is what they found. They found over 760 patent families and thousands of applications and patents that actually currently exist on coronavirus vaccines. We know that a lot of this technology is already fenced off by these patent filings, and we'll see how high that fence is next year when we see it in relation to COVID-19. So we know there's a lot of patents already. An article that was published in Nature magazine actually looked at then the mRNA, which is the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, which of course, as Sundar has pointed out, we are discussing ad nauseum as if we will have access to these, cold storage facilities for these vaccines. But again, you see a high amount of patenting over here, and you see Moderna, COVAX, BioNTech, GSK collectively own nearly half of patent applications and patents. So again, this is an area that is highly patented. So we're seeing that we've got high patents. And then, like I said, there's this traditional idea, but that it's fine that those patents are there because it's patent management that's really the issue. But we're already starting to see halfway through the pandemic, even as research is going on, and even as we're looking at clinical trial results coming out.
5 more minutes.
Yeah, that's fine. litigation and licensing is sort of overtaking the discussion on how these patents are being, these vaccines are being researched and they're coming out. So the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, which is the first one to show results or claim results, is a platform technology that is licensed from a company called Equitable. Equitable licensed this from Arbutus and Genevant Sciences. I'm sorry, I'm just saying out the names, but these are just to give you an idea of how complicated the licensing landscape is. But Arbutus had actually terminated this agreement with Equitable in 2018, saying that it could not sub-license it. But there's a separate partnership, and so maybe Pfizer and BioNTech will not get sued. But they have now been sued by an entirely separate company, saying that a fluorescent protein that they use to actually track how the vaccine works was patented by another company, and that company is now demanding a royalty on this. Moderna also relied on this technology that came from Arbutus and tried to challenge the patent on that, and which they did not succeed in doing. So let's see what happens with. But there's another issue that has come up with Moderna's patents, and that has been brought forward by a lot of the US-based organizations, saying that there was massive US funding in the creation of this technology, which Moderna was required by law to declare in its patent applications, but it has not done that. Those investigations by the US-based access groups and groups like Public Citizen and KEI have actually shown that throughout the chain, there was massive government and US government early investment. The US government has even filed patents that would actually give them a stake or ownership of this vaccine technology, that the Moderna vaccine relies on a stabilized spike protein that was developed by the US government, that the US government has funded 100% Moderna's project to bring the vaccine to US FDA approval, and taxpayers in the US have paid twice because they've already pre-orders for an additional $1.5 billion to secure doses in this. So you see the extent of government involvement in the Moderna vaccine, and yet you see Moderna being given the ability to actually get pre-orders and to price their vaccine quite high. Moderna has recently, of course, also said, and a lot of people suspect that this is because of all the IP battles that they've been facing over their vaccine, is that they plan not to enforce their patents on this if other companies plan to use the technology to develop it for the course of the pandemic and during the course of the pandemic. Of course, what that means for the post-pandemic period, and because we know that these vaccines are probably going to be required long-term, remains to be seen, and this applies only if their patents and not their know-how. The second area where we've seen public funding really come in is the Oxford vaccine, now known as the AstraZeneca vaccine. And I think many people must be wondering how it went from the Oxford vaccine to the AstraZeneca vaccine. Oxford, at the University of Oxford, initially had actually said that their default would be that any technology they develop, any vaccine they develop, would go out for non-exclusive licensing. And they were particularly keen that the technology would reach developing countries. There was an initial discussion with Merck, but they were worried that it would not reach developing countries. But then somewhere along the way, AstraZeneca entered the scene, and apparently this was at the behest of Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation, and I think Rohit will have a lot more to say on that, telling the Oxford University that actually you need a partner, and if that partner demands exclusive rights, as AstraZeneca has, then you'd have to consider this if you want your vaccine to actually reach out. I don't have time to go through this, but I would encourage you both to read both these articles, because it's actually quite interesting to see how this story went from a university developing technology to now exclusively in the hands of AstraZeneca. And we have access to only one agreement that AstraZeneca has made with different partners, which is the one with Fiocruz in Brazil. And it's quite interesting to read that it's just a 12-month agreement, possibility of increase. The territory is only Brazil. So you see Big Pharma stepping in, using public funding and getting access to these technologies, and then dividing up the world into who gets access and who doesn't. It's not just patents that are the concern. There's also a serious concern with trade secrets. And trade secret law is actually a much broader law than patents, where if there's any confidential information and a company can show that they attempted to keep it confidential, then you have to by law protect them from disclosure. And for vaccines, these kind of trade secrets can cover biological medicines, cell lines, genomic information, other biological material, data about the effectiveness of the vaccine, and even negative information about whether the vaccine would actually work can fall under trade secrets. I also put an undisclosed data, test data, or other data for coming out of the last webinar. And Chinu, when he was giving the sort of overall view of what happened in the last webinar, stopped at the point where the CDSCO representative said that, we're deliberating whether we put clinical trial data into the public domain. But I want to read out his exact quote, because he said that putting clinical data in the public domain, it has been raised many times, we have deliberated also, Because US FDA, EMA, they prepare a summary basis for the approval and they put it on the website after proper adaptation. Because if we cannot adapt properly, the company can actually sue us that how have you put my trade secret in the public domain? So our conversation on asking for transparency on the vaccine trials and on the vaccine trial data, you now have trade secrets, the regulator being concerned about being sued. It's a different matter that public interest should override this, but it was very worrying to me that our drug regulator is worried about being sued for trade secrets when dealing with our demands for transparency. So should we be concerned? Yes. What is the result of these exclusive rights landing up with big pharma? What we're seeing is secret deals, high prices. We're seeing short-term commitments. I think almost all of you must have seen the pre-orders that are coming in from the companies. You're seeing a wide range of prices from the $3 price that Serum is talking about for developing countries for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. To thousands of rupees for the many others that are going to go into different developed countries, and we're going to see inevitable shortages. So we know that despite the pre-orders, the actual ability of these companies to actually deliver on those orders is limited. And it's quite surprising because I don't think these shortages are inevitable. TWN has this fascinating website called VaxSnap Up, which is actually tracking vaccine manufacturing capacity. So we know the capacity is there. It probably needs some upgradation. You probably need some technical assistance coming to this. But we probably have much more vaccine production capacity than what the pre-orders show because the companies are holding on to that so that they can keep charging higher prices. What sort of impact has this had on developing country manufacturers? We're starting to see international law firms advising developing country manufacturers who are looking to develop the vaccine, saying, look, be careful, there will be future patent wars. You need to make sure that you monitor what patents you might be infringing. You need to do patent landscapes. Serum Institute has taken the Oxford vaccine license for 68 countries, Novavax for 92 countries. We don't actually know what these countries are. We don't know what the terms, the duration, the supply outside of the territory is. I think Sundar also mentioned this. Are there timelines for deliveries to the other countries? What are the priorities? Are there prescribed prices? And the Serum Institute has talked about these licenses saying, look, it mainly covers Africa, India, and some parts of Asia. And when our own candidates come in about a year and a half, then we'll go to Europe and the United States with our own candidates. So our developing country manufacturers are already taking on very restricted licenses. Unfortunate thing to see in the middle of a pandemic. In India, we've seen that ICMR, and Malini brought this up in her presentation in the last session, is actually helping Bharat Biotech, Zydus, and Serum Institute at different levels. But again, we don't know what the agreements are and the amount of money the government is putting in, and whether that would actually allow them to expand the number of manufacturers of these vaccines. And as the webinar 2 actually showed, that there is a second role of the public, and that is the volunteers for the clinical trials. So in fact, it's not just public funding, public intellect, ICMR, it is people who are actually volunteering for these trials. So there is a very strong role of the public. So yes, we should be concerned. What should we do? I think there are different ways of looking at this. For some, it could just be starting the drudgery work, which takes time, but actually showing that many of these vaccine patents are not valid and should not have been granted to show that the system is actually failing. There is a South Africa-India TRIPS waiver proposal, and I think Sangeeta will probably talk about that later, so I'm not going into that, and most of you probably know about this, which is to simply lift the TRIPS requirements on this. If you look at WHO's COVID-19 vaccine landscape, what everyone focuses on is this first part. What is in clinical evaluation? But I think you should also look at the second part, which is over 164 candidate vaccines. And you look at universities, local producers, government producers across developing countries actually looking at vaccine production. And I think this is actually quite fascinating because at some level, this takes me back to what happened with H1N1. When the exact same conversation happened about vaccines for H1N1, you saw the US getting access to the vaccines first and telling everyone else to stay in line. And India started producing, and by June 2010, which was 5 or 6 months later, we did have our own vaccine candidate. So I would say that at least for the manufacturers in our countries, we have to think about actually just getting into manufacturing if there is an approved vaccine, of course, which is safe and effective. Yeah. Otherwise, this is what we're going to end up with.
Thank you. So our third and last speaker is Rohit Malpani. Rohit is an independent consultant specializing on issues of access to medicine, antibiotic resistance, and role of artificial intelligence in health. So Rohit, in a way, is a veteran in the areas of IP and access issues. He's going to talk to us on the role of international agencies and development and distribution of COVID vaccines.
Okay, great. So thanks for the chance to speak. And I will try to run through some of the different international initiatives and agencies that are involved with COVID-19 vaccines. And these will be the things that I will try to cover. So I'll start with the ACTA Accelerator, then talk specifically about the COVAX Facility, then a bit about the different parts of the WHO. And then finally, I want to end with a more specific discussion on the Gates Foundation. So the ACT Accelerator was sort of launched quite early on during the pandemic, and it's meant to focus sort of equally on medicines, vaccines, and diagnostics, and also somewhat to focus on health systems, although it's really weighted much more towards vaccines and much less towards the other components. A lot of funding was promised to the ACT Accelerator, and I think at this point, really the only funding that's materialized is for vaccines, which has its own problems. It's really intended to be run by governments, or at least to be led by governments, and especially by the governments of South Africa and Norway. But really, when you look at the ACT Accelerator, it's really run by two foundations and also by global health agencies. And this is sort of just a schematic of who is involved in the ACT Accelerator. And we'll be focusing mostly on vaccines in this discussion. So just to kind of focus in a bit more then on which agencies are involved with vaccines. For research and development, there's really two, the Gates Foundation and CEPI, which is known as the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. For financing and procurement, there are really the COVAX Facility, which also includes something known as the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment. And then for determining how to allocate vaccines equitably between countries is meant to be the World Health Organization. And I've also just put a note there that the World Bank has sort of identified a $12 billion fund for procurement and health system strengthening for vaccines, although what it will focus on and how it will provide funding is still to be determined. So I just wanted to take a step back to say, very broadly, these are the concerns that you could sort of assign to anything occurring within the ACT Accelerator today, or really across this entire architecture. The first, very broadly, is about transparency of the different activities underway, as well as some of the contracts that are being signed by the different health agencies with companies, or I guess with governments. Secondly is just, I think as the first presentation was noting, was this unwillingness to really engage in what is the right model of research and development, and also to act very actively against intellectual property barriers. And then I think broadly is this issues around governance, and really that you see this sort of affinity towards pharmaceutical companies, really an animosity towards civil society, and not really a lot of space for recipient governments to engage in a lot of the discussions and to provide their feedback. So that the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations was established after the Ebola outbreak. And this is intended to accelerate the development of vaccines and platforms. And it was really supposed to only focus on the late stage clinical trials, but for COVID-19, it has also expanded into manufacturing. Now, it has 9 vaccine candidates it's focused on, but only 2 of them are in phase 3. And to Kajal's point, maybe some of what will be interesting over time are some of the earlier stage vaccine candidates, which it's investing in. But there are some real problems with CEPI that existed before COVID-19, but I think are really coming to the fore. The first is that in its own access conditions and contracts that it signs with companies, it accepts tiered pricing, and which is especially going to affect upper middle income countries as they're defined by World Bank criteria. It really takes a hands-off approach towards intellectual property. So it does not try to encourage the non-patenting of vaccines or subsequent inventions. And it does not seek to encourage the pooling or sharing of intellectual property. And its contracts only have very limited margin rights, which are sort of shaped around triggers. And I would say just generally, even if CEPI had a sort of, let's say, beneficial approach towards these issues, in the COVID-19 pandemic, it doesn't really have the financial firepower to really push companies or to overcome the prevailing approach of warp speed or what the EU is doing. And this just sort of represents the inequity in spending. So the United States has already spent over $10 billion on research and development. CEPI has spent about 10% of that. And so ultimately for governments, they can, for companies, they can sort of ignore what CEPI provides because they can ultimately just rely upon the funding and supports that they get from a few governments that are now hoarding vaccines. Now, the COVAX facility, so now if we're moving towards the procurement and distribution, was created during the pandemic. It has now about 184 countries, although I think there's a bit of a fudging around some countries which may only be providing money and some countries which may not ultimately participate. It's not intended to really go beyond up to 50% of vaccine needs, but as I'll talk about, there are those countries that will get only 20% perhaps of their needs met, and some that will get 50% of their needs met, especially in the next 12 to 18 months. And it's really split, I think, into two sets of countries. There's sort of those that exist within what's known as the advanced market commitment. And then there's those countries that are sort of self-paying countries, and I'll explain the difference. So the advanced market commitment was sort of identified as 92 low and middle income countries and sort of IDA eligible countries to receive financial support from donor countries for purchasing vaccines. And when they sort of identified the advanced market commitment, they had also said that it could make investments into research and development or manufacturing, but that hasn't materialized. There is some disagreement as to whether or not countries will have to make a small copayment per dose. I think that still remains sort of in dispute. And funding really wasn't emerging to pay for the vaccines on behalf of some of these countries, but it has emerged in the last few months and even the last few weeks. But I guess the cynical view would be that this should really be viewed more as a payoff than it is really in terms from some of the donor countries, instead of those countries providing supply. So, and then COVAX also has a set of self-paying countries. So there might be about 80 to 90 of these countries. And these countries can either make a large upfront payment to give them more flexibility to choose which vaccines, or a back-end payment to pay for vaccines. And I think it's worth noting that some of the countries included in here have not signed their own bilateral deals, are nominally viewed as sort of OECD or high-income countries, but I think in some respects feel as vulnerable as many of the other countries that are on the wrong side of vaccine nationalism. But I think with the COVAX facility, despite what it's sort of done, there are a range of concerns. And again, I think these were sort of already identified to some extent. The first is that it's not engaging at all on intellectual property. It's not even sort of mentioning that this is an issue. It is not sort of able to engage upstream around research and development and some of the choices that are being made through the contracts and approaches and even priority setting. This is really left to CEPI, to Gates, and to some of the bilateral donors. It's not engaging on investing in supplier manufacturing. It is potentially permitting tiered pricing. Of course, it does not have enough supply to be able to provide equitable allocation between countries. It probably will not have enough funding to ensure that there is sufficient cold chain or even ultra cold chain capacity for many different countries. And I think there's a sense, without knowing for sure, that there's this inequity within the COVAX facility, really between the AMC 92 countries and then the self-paying countries, where on the one hand, it may be that the self-paying countries will get wider access to some vaccines, in particular if they already have the capacity to provide those vaccines through cold chain or through other resources. On the other hand, Kajal was just noting that some of these deals that are being signed, for instance, with the Serum Institute and Novavax, are really only focused on anywhere from these sort of 56 to 92 AMC countries. So you could end up having a situation in which high-income countries have their supply, AMC 92 countries have a little bit of supply, and then the upper middle income countries are sort of left out in the cold. And again, that all remains to be seen. Now, just to come to the WHO, this is sort of some of the different things that they're doing that have a relationship to access, whether it's the solidarity trials, the regulatory approval, the technology access pool, or the equitable allocation mechanism. With the technology access pool, this was first conceptualized and launched as early as sort of April or May of this year, with the support of about 41 countries and really the leadership of the Costa Rican government. It was intended to promote the sharing of, on a voluntary basis, of intellectual property, know-how, cell lines into a technology pool. But I think it's important to emphasize it's basically received nominal support or virtually no support from the different agencies within the ACT Accelerator, as well as donor countries. And I would say from my viewpoint of having participated within the ACT Accelerator, there is also just, in some cases, active opposition towards it, or really rejection. And we've also sort of heard this offhand. And I think it's important reflecting on the fact that the COVAX facility was essentially designed and launched at the same time. So the idea that somehow you can get one off the ground, that's actually far more complicated, and not to get the technology access pool, really shows just the insufficiency of the response. The equitable allocation mechanism is meant to sort of set norms to persuade countries to share supply. It's meant to first focus on 3% of the population or frontline workers, then sort of 20%, which is defined maybe more as high-risk populations, and then the rest of the population. But it's not legally enforceable with companies or governments, and it's only really meant to be guidance for the COVAX facility and I guess for governments. And it's really not connected to the things that sort of would enable it to work. So whether you're talking financing, manufacturing, intellectual property interventions, types of R&D models, cold chain, so it sounds nice and it looks nice, but it doesn't necessarily translate into what's needed to create the right outcomes. I just want to end by talking a bit on the Gates Foundation. And I want to emphasize that, even as we're sort of presenting all these different things, that the Gates Foundation really was largely responsible for the creation of the ACT Accelerator, COVAX, and some of the other initiatives. And it's also taken an active role itself in separately investing in first, second, and third generation vaccines. And this is a bit to Kaljiv's point that actually they're already looking now at these second and third generation vaccines and what they want to do. And they have taken an active role in speaking out against vaccine nationalism and also sort of ensuring the cold chain meets the moment. And they are obviously very aware of intellectual property issues, and they actually have quite active negotiations on intellectual property through its investments. But they don't publish their intellectual property terms and conditions they signed. And we know from previous practice that they're very limited, basically just limited margin rights for a very limited number of countries. And they've actively sought to discourage the ACT Accelerator from engaging on intellectual property issues. And really, this is sort of the idea that they would rather persuade each company to build out manufacturing, within its own walled garden, and to convince countries to share the supply that they're hoarding. And they've usually sought to promote an approach in general, and I would say this applies elsewhere, where they really work through the largest drug companies, and I would include, the Serum Institute into that. So the idea that big is beautiful, and we're not really going to try to be creative or do anything that sort of is disruptive or transformative. And so what you see is actually from the past, for instance, with the pneumococcal vaccine, back in 2008, instead of trying to break open the intellectual property and generate a lot of supply as fast as possible, they instead designed a very large subsidy that went to Pfizer and GSK that didn't really expand access to the vaccine for many countries, really until just now, where you're now getting low-cost supply coming onto the market because the intellectual property is expired. Kajal mentioned what happened with the Oxford vaccine, in which they basically were proud of the fact that they had convinced Oxford to work exclusively with AstraZeneca instead of working with many different manufacturers or companies at the same time. And I think it's important to recognize that, a lot of organizations and health agencies and governments are all funded or supported by the Gates Foundation. And so you don't really have any criticism, and instead you have an echo chamber with respect to what they are doing and strategizing. And so just as the last slide, again, international agencies matter, but really only at the margins. And I think the concern should be about doing no harm. They shouldn't be validating the responses of drug companies that are insufficient. And they really should not be acting as a shield against the more comprehensive responses and approaches that are required for technology sharing and access. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So now we will open the floor for question, answer, and discussion. So before that, I would just like to link on one point is that Kajal has extensively explained to us what kind of patent barriers are existing and in the past related to many existing vaccines, and the same thing would be replicated in the case of COVID vaccines, and also the role of trade secret, which is very less explored area till recently. So I would like to connect that with the regulatory barrier, which is created in a way. The regulatory agencies are acting as an enforcement agency for the trade secret. So in the case of patent, what happens is that you can issue a compulsory license. Basically, you can issue a government intervention through which you can allow the generic manufacturer, or what we call it, let me be more scientifically use the term, more scientific term, non-originator vaccine producer, a permission to use the patent. But there many of the non-originator vaccine developers also has the ability to technologically replicate this, the originator's vaccine. But then comes the regulatory barrier. Since the non-originator has not obtained the starting materials or the cell lines or the technology from the originator vaccine makers, then they would be asked to replicate all the tests. Or no, it will be treated as an originator vaccine manufacturer. So that's why the PCV vaccine, even though Serum Institute is producing, but it took 9 years or 10 years to produce it, because there is no generic pathway, regulatory pathway is not existing for vaccines. Unlike in the case of generic small molecule, you can produce it in 6 months' time, okay, maximum, or 1 year. Even a monoclonal antibody, you can produce it even 1 year, but because of the regulatory barrier, again, it takes 3 to 5 years. But at least there is a biosimilar pathway is existing. In the case of vaccines, there is no such pathway existing, and the trade secret indirectly enforced through the regulatory agency, saying that, look, you have not obtained this technology or starting material from the originator, so therefore you will be treated as an original manufacturer, vaccine manufacturer. So you have to carry out all the trials. One example I'll mention to you, and then we'll go for the question and answer session. So the AstraZeneca vaccine, Serum Institute is producing because they obtained all the technologies from the Oxford. So it will be treated from a regulatory point of view, only a facility change. Okay, instead of producing it in AstraZeneca's facilities, they are producing it in Serum Institute facility. But if tomorrow another vaccine company wants to make that same Serum Institute vaccine in India, they would be treated as an originator vaccine maker, and it will take maybe years or months. So that's a problem. That's why the CTAP is an initiative which is mentioned here, but it is failed. Nobody is showing any interest. That's why the waiver proposal becomes very relevant, because that the Kajal already mentioned, there was apprehension by the our own regulator saying that if you put the data, that's also clinical trial data, will be sued for trade secret. If there is a waiver proposal in place, probably the regulator can put this information, this trade secret, in public domain, and to facilitate a generic production or a non-originator production of this vaccine. Nowadays, we should also look into this regulatory barrier. Again, the blame also goes to WHO, which all these years, regulating vaccines, failed to develop a non-originator regulatory pathway for vaccines. So now let me open it for question and answer session. So, even though my colleague insisted that should not be called for a question and answer, still I invite Veena to flag some of the questions she might have on this issue.
Thank you all for an excellent presentation and very well put, very comprehensive. There are quite a few questions in the Q&A that you all can take a look at. But also just to understand a little deeply, and this could be open to all, that if these international players are not around, and if they do not fund some of the stuff, and just playing the devil's advocate, do you think that there would be a distribution of the vaccines fairly, just if it is left on the governments to do it? And will the governments really be committed to invest that much money had all these people not coming? What do you all think?
No, I think that it's a good question, and so I look at it in two ways. On the one hand, the benefit we're supposed to have is we've had 2 decades, right, of building this architecture to respond to HIV and TB and malaria and to different immunization preventable diseases. And so I think there's a strong expectation that we're supposed to have of what they're supposed to do. We have lessons that have been learned. We know what works. We know what delivers the right outcomes. And the frustration, therefore, is we should have these expectations, but the lessons that have been learned are being discarded for a new ideology. And so I think that's why we have to be so critical, because at this moment where we really have no margin for error, where we know the margin for error ultimately costs lives, they are making lots of errors. They are repeating mistakes that were made 20 years ago and that we shouldn't have. The other side of it, of course, is that they will make a difference. You do want to create the space for countries to get things right. You do want to be able to create a more equitable approach to these issues. But we can't just sort of say that anything, something that's better than nothing is good enough. There's really no excuse to be making so many mistakes throughout. And again, I think it really traces back to some of what is being guided into this and sort of losing sight of what worked in the past.
Rohit, it's not 20 years, it's actually even the last 10 years. So while I was looking up a lot of, trying to look at what happened with H5N1, with H1N1, it's almost unreal, because you see the press releases put out by the WHO at the time on equitable access to vaccines, social distancing is what we need to use. It's a repeat every outbreak, that the same messages are coming out, the same issues are being brought up. And the reality is, Veena, you're absolutely right. There is no way out of this other than international solidarity. The problem is that international solidarity is being pinned on private profits and private interest. And we know that the public interest will not be served by that. And I think there's two things. One is the immediate concern of this pandemic and what we're going to look at. The reality is that what we do now is going to inform us for the next 10 years, for the next pandemic. And if we keep going around in circles, and I'm telling you, like, somebody should actually look at what we did with H1N1, H5N1, and now with COVID. We are going around the same circles, but every time the outcome is worse. And we simply cannot afford to entrench these systems anymore. Where universities are spending public funding, that list to me is actually fascinating, with the number of universities that have jumped into this. The opportunity to take that public funding, public interest, and make international solidarity instead of chopping the world into markets and patients, I think is an opportunity we can't let go of. But it will be in our hands to ask for that accountability, and we have to ask for it. We can't sit back and wait for the information to come to us of this is the agreement or this is the deal that they have reached. I think the second area where we're seeing a serious setback, and Rohit also mentioned this, is that the one thing the HIV movement had done was got itself into the door. You could not have a conversation at the international level or the national level about policies related to access to treatment without people living with HIV in the room. In this pandemic, civil society, public health groups have been actively locked out of the doors. 6 months have been spent by multiple groups knocking on those doors saying, we want to be on these platforms, we want to be consulted, and being left out. And that's a massive setback, to say that the people and communities have no voice in these policy-making decisions or implementation.
I think one issue is that the question of, will governments give funds? Given the overall economic situation, given the overall way in which governments have become more right-wing in this period, it's very difficult to actually, though such a crisis is there, see them actually opening their pockets. But the reverse is, if governments don't step in, any notion of equity in allocation will be completely lost. It's just not going to happen. Even when they say health workers, within health workers, it will be specialists and doctors. When it comes to nurses, it will be sparing. When it comes to frontline workers, it will be absent. You're going to, without government intervention, left to markets, any notion of equity in allocation will be completely lost between nations, within sectors, within groups. So I don't see the option. And if there is an option where governments can intervene without financing, I haven't heard about it. Because in some sense, purely regulatory measures won't work unless there is a certain thing. So there is a whole area where it will have to act. But there are reasons to believe there are countries that are acting. Even Bangladesh may make certain right moves in some of these, which I hear from. I don't know enough depth in terms of their own manufacturing, their production. South Korea, some of these Australian countries, Australia, for example, some of them are working on being able to do that. And even learning from past experience, the East Asian nations have done relatively much better. They have East Asian Pacific area, they have actually not got any significant epidemic because they've learned from the SARS-2, they've learned from the past epidemic, and they have actually built in systems which were much more robust. They were able to expand and scale up their testing in record times. Being able to do so in vaccines is perhaps more likely to happen there than elsewhere. So I think there is if governments don't move, then these things won't happen.
But Sundar, in this case, as Kajal already pointed out, in the innovation market, if you take the innovation as a market, there is a huge funding from the public sector. It's a substantial funding is from the public sector. Unlike in a normal situation where the corporation can say that even though they never reveal the data, but they say they invest a huge on R&D. But here now it's very clear it's all public funding, and but what we see is that there is no concrete commitment to transfer that publicly funded outcome of the R&D to translate into a public good.
This was the point I was making. This new set of reforms, the second phase of reform, I've not been characterized in literature that way. The second phase of reform, this is post-2008, this gung-ho way in which public financing can be used to actually shore up corporate profits in a major way. It was there earlier also. But the scale at which this happens is very important. And that is therefore, that's why this notion of global public goods is a very interesting notion, because you can actually say that these financing is a necessity to treat it differently from the usual business as usual approach. We have to actually insist that all of this, you delink the research, pay for the research separately, delink the price, the cost of R&D from the price of the product. These are well-known recommendations. But I think this is a time to push for some of these. There is an opportunity to push for it because the scale of public financing in this research is truly humongous. It's really very large, and therefore it's much more visible when they make the profits on this.
So that again takes us to the next level. When it comes to downstream, there is a huge public funding again to scale up the manufacturing directly for the scaling up of the manufacturing facilities. Plus, there is a huge advanced market commitment that also the money has been transferred to the corporations. So there is a complete de-risking for the R&D as well as for manufacturing. And still, there is no concrete commitment to translate this concept of public good, global public good into a reality. So, Rohit, what do you think? Yeah, both of you, I would ask that. What is exactly happening? So you also.
There's one question in the box from Gayatri Sabarwal as to what really we are saying so many negatives. What does she think we should be saying as positive? What should we think we should do? And one of the points of entry, other than is the scaling up of manufacture, of domestic manufacture, with whatever it takes for technology transfer. Because that relates to another question that Geeta has been asking. Do you think that WTO is going to agree to the waiver proposal, or it is going to actually win it there? But the point is, we bring that into debate. And at some point, whatever means we have for being able to enforce the technology transfer to increase the total number of domestic manufacturers and to develop second and third generation vaccines, which are going to be absolutely necessary. The vaccines we are working with now are not the vaccines we are going to stay with in 18 months. So if we do have the time to actually work that out. So I think there is both of these areas, public financing in India at least must be leveraged to make this goal. And maybe after how they do. South Africa has the problem. There is a huge schism between its domestic policy and what they advocate at global space. India, there is a schism, but perhaps we can do better in forcing some extent of domestic manufacture, public financing in research, developing some of these products to our advantage.
I think there are a few hands raised. Could we ask Dinesh Abroy to speak?
See, I have an alternate view on why this public financing of R&D is humongous. Precisely because, back to the walls, there was an attempt made when even there was capacity. But this very capacity was sleeping all through. And even if now they have woken up, this waking up does not mean that they have not submitted themselves to the big business. They in fact have, whether it is Tata's, whether it is Bharat Biotech or Serum. In fact, we should see our companies part of the big business now. I think we should, while there can be distinctions still drawn between these companies and others, but this particular phase has shown that the government has not intervened to actually make them behave differently. If the government policies you look at, so I think action needs to be taken at home. And if we start taking that action, probably other countries will also pick up. Precisely in the past, India did act, and we acted in political way. And I suppose at home, while TRIPS waiver we try in WTO, at home we need to act, and we need to act saying TRIPS flexibilities can be used in India. Why not we use them? Why not then we put in many more manufacturers, bring them into it? That's the way forward, I think, in my view.
Thank you. There is can I read out some of the questions, then I'll come back to Rohit. So the first question is that, is it necessary to incentivize the pharma companies for different stages in vaccine development? Is there a huge involvement of publicly funded universities at different stages, including the initial research of vaccine molecules? I think this has been answered. I think we can move to the next question. I think it's any next question is from Vidya Sagar Kumar. Is any social responsibility of publisher where they have situated that the type of vaccine may be available for common people without payment, like costly medicine have brought the private hospitals in India some months ago, and there was no drugs are available government of Indian hospitals? Anybody would like to answer that? Otherwise we can, it's about the prices, I guess. Then Gayatri Sabarwal's question and Geeta Sen's question have been mentioned. So there is one more question on TRIPS waiver. So Professor Geeta Sen's question is directed to Kajal. What is your sense of chance of waiver proposal? But Nivedita also asked a same question. What do you make of the TRIPS waiver proposal and the response of the developed countries that the provisions of compulsory licensing already exist? So you can club together and answer, then we'll read out. There are a few more questions and then we'll open it for again.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for those questions. And I actually sped through that part because I thought Sangeeta was also going to come on. But for those of you who don't know, India and South Africa have put in a proposal to the WTO TRIPS Council saying that just for the pandemic, all intellectual property requirements of the TRIPS agreement, so that includes not just patents, but patents, undisclosed information, copyright, trademark, everything should be, those requirements should be lifted, primarily because this is going to help us speed access both to medicines, vaccines, including technologies like PPE, which is something that we don't discuss that often. And this proposal went. There was, of course, as can be expected, immediately a response from developed countries saying, no, this is not required. It's not acceptable. There's enough flexibilities within the TRIPS agreement. There's a bunch of developing countries, and I think Gopa can speak to that in more detail, who have not maybe expressed open support yet, but hopefully will soon. But what's interesting is, as Nivedita points out, is this immediate response saying, oh, but you can issue a compulsory license. And for those of you who follow the access to medicines debate, this is almost laughable, because the amount that we have been told that these are last resort measures, be careful when you use them. So yeah, I think one good thing is at least they've acknowledged that these flexibilities can and should be used. And I would take that as an immediate win, saying if governments step in, that's good. But the reality is, like we saw with these vaccine platforms, that just issuing the compulsory license will not be sufficient, right? If you want to avoid patent litigation down the lane, and we're starting to see with a lot of the generic producers, we're seeing with our drug regulator, this concern about what if we get sued. Now, if you want to take that headache off, then you have to remove all these restrictions. So I think this response of saying a compulsory license will be enough, we know that's not going to be enough. We know it's going to actually take a lot more action to do that. What are the chances of the waiver proposal going through? I would leave that to Gopa and Rohit and maybe to comment on that. I think it'll be interesting to see how much pushback there is on this, but I think what it does sufficiently, even if it doesn't go through, is it actually creates so much pressure for other developed countries not to react or not to take action when developing countries move on ensuring access, that I think that is also sort of a side effect that we should see of this proposal going through. So one is, I think the push for the proposal should be really, really strong. It requires a lot more support from civil society than we're seeing right now, even though I think PHM, TWN, so many organizations have campaigns going on right now. We have to convince other governments to start taking action, and maybe use this also as a platform for developing countries to actually combine their action both on developing vaccines and supplying them, on medicines, etc. So I know that's not a clear answer, but I think it would be important for the next two TRIPS Council meetings. One is this month, is that right, Gopa? In the next 2 weeks, I think, on the 20th of November?
I think 20th of November. Friday is the next informal meeting.
Yeah, Friday is the next informal meeting, and then one should be in a few months later. I think it probably requires a lot more support from us to actually make some kind of headway. And even if you don't get the ultimate result, anything that comes in the terms of international cooperation and saying that developing countries can take these actions, I think would be a huge win in any case.
So Rohit, would you like to respond to this TRIPS-related speculation?
Yeah, I mean, my feeling first is just to reiterate what Kajal says, which is it's very useful to actually force this to be put front and center, because again, the strategy has been to just sort of say this isn't an issue, it's not a barrier. So I think this has forced a bit of equilibrium. And again, I think for the countries that are opposing this, you can hoard supply or you can have your companies hoard intellectual property, but you can't do both. And so, even if it doesn't necessarily go through, I think as we're noting, if individual countries starts to take certain measure, or if it puts informal pressure on companies to start signing deals, then I think it's very beneficial. I think I could imagine that the best route forward is going to be very vocal support from a larger number of countries that are on the wrong side of this divide, and trying to convince the other countries to just abstain from this. So they're not going to introduce a waiver, but I think there's some hope in that. But again, I think just tactically, this is really just forcing this issue to be put to the forefront and putting a lot of these countries into an uncomfortable position where they have 6 doses per person in their country. And then they're also just saying, well, we're just not going to bother allowing you to have the intellectual property. And I think it's very useful to see the data coming out and to start seeing the vaccines go forward, because I think that's going to make it look even worse. And it's unfortunately, we have to have that kind of picture come out, but I think that's what's required.
Just to add, I think also it puts the companies on notice. And I think that's really crucial. I think both from civil society and government saying that, look, we're willing to take action and we will take it, regardless of the repercussions. We're going down the right route. We're going down formally. We're trying to get a waiver. But I think it shows the urgency of taking action, and it points out that there is a serious problem, as Rohit is saying. So I think it's not just putting developed countries on notice saying that your pressure on developing countries is not going to work in the midst of a pandemic like this, but it's putting the companies on notice as well. That look, I mean, you have to get your policies in place. Otherwise, we will take action. So I think that's a big thing to come out of this as well.
There are a couple of hands raised, Gopal. There is Samarjit's hand raised for quite some time.
Yeah. Thank you so much, for giving me the opportunity. Yeah, it was very nice to hear all of you. I especially, this support very much in Dr. Sundaraman's view of engaging government to ensure the solidarity. But at the same time, I also understand that perhaps government alone, without support of the local self-governance, as well as the non-profit CSOs, probably will not be able to create that kind of demand. We understand, and this the discussion was more of from the supply side. But what about the people, who are not actually aware of this? What kind of actions are needed? So that also needs to be discussed, some point of time. Thank you so much.
Sundar, would you like to answer?
No, I take the point. It is certainly that in terms of mobilization, in terms of people's awareness, in terms of utilization of a vaccine, we have a frontier. We should not assume that people are going to queue up for the vaccine because it's such a rare commodity. And the problem will be that many of the people who are workers, migrant workers, people who are likely to be in occupations where the risk is much more because social intermixing in the nature is much more, may not have the same degree of awareness. For example, sanitation workers. You would need to actually work with areas to build on the demand side also. And there is going to be an important role in how local self-governments are involved in the prioritization and involved in reaching out to particularly marginalized sections in terms of vulnerable sections. Vulnerable because of general social conditions and vulnerable because of specific COVID-19 vulnerabilities. Whether it is of comorbidities or whether it is because of age or whether it is because of occupation. So I think that point is well taken. That will come up immediately. There are some general circulars that have been issued by the government, which is more like a tokenish thing to say that they have done it without quite understanding what it takes. So I think that point is valid.
And there is also a question, maybe Sundar, you could answer that. Do sponsoring by ICMR of clinical trials, other government agencies funding vaccine development or trials in India allow them to coerce the fast tracking, or they can, use their financial powers to fast track the regulatory approval? So this is the question, not directly linked to our today's topic, but still, if you're interested, you can answer. And Kajal, there is a question directed, the question answer related to trips to you. If you can have a look at it, it would be nice.
I think this fast tracking word needs to be a bit cautious, because at some point, very often what we are landing up with is getting the necessary protocols need not and should not be compromised on that. But there are bureaucratic delays in approval, bureaucratic delays in getting that part of it can be done, especially in the regulatory part. But there isn't much bureaucratic delay. Much of it is actually relaxing norms to unsafe levels, not having certain degrees of protocols in place. The problems will be immense, because if you have vaccines which have higher degrees of adverse effects or lesser degrees of efficacy, the problems that you would create for future rounds of vaccination are very high. So in some sense, I don't think that we should be aiming to be the quickest off the block. It's not as if we are going to manage to immunize everybody in less than 5 years. So you need to actually look at it. So this fast tracking is something that I'm a little bit worried about. In research funding, yes, in some sense, where there is if clinical trial funding is the bottleneck, especially for India-developed vaccines, which will have not yet reached that stage. But at some point there, of course, I think they should have a special fund pool from which they are able to support that. That is going to be important because these vaccines which are developed outside have a different way, but these which are indigenously developed going to require support, and we need to work on that. But again, without compromise on the ethical standards, because that will be more robust in the conclusions also.
There is another question here in the Q&A by Malini. She's asking, the Indian government appears to not be making arrangements for foreign vaccines and depending on vaccines that are being developed and can be produced in India. The government is also supporting the development of these vaccines through financing and partnerships with the private companies. Can any of the speakers suggest what advocacy is needed with the government regarding securing vaccine? What is your opinion about India betting almost exclusively on Indian-made vaccines? Does this put us in a comfortable place?
I think, in fact, Gopa should come in on that. So,
All four of you.
yeah, because this tracking of how much manufacture is happening at what point is a certain type of detail that is difficult. We don't really know all these answers. So I don't want to hazard a quick answer to a complex question of this sort. We'll have to look at it and see exactly, are there no commitment? There is news today that government is entering into some discussions with Moderna. I don't know of Indian government having any written agreements with either the Indian manufacturers or the international manufacturers. We know that Indian manufacturers have agreement with big pharma for voluntary licensing to manufacture. But what proportion of it they are committed to give India seems to be what the Serum Institute declares as large as 50% we will commit. With that statement supported by any piece of paper, is there an agreement? Is there some binding on them? So these three things, what are the prices? What are the volumes? What is the schedule of supply? All three are important. You can say I'm giving 50% and give it from 2022. It's not going to help. So what is the schedule? What is it that they have actually? There doesn't seem to be commitments even from the domestic manufacturer, let alone import commitments. But I don't know enough because some of these are not transparent in the public domain. But maybe people who are following it closer will have some information on this. I don't know the terms of the agreements which are there between these companies and the government of India. To my knowledge, there's none.
I think I'll just bring Rohit after a small explanation regarding this. The vaccine manufacturing capabilities that only area where government of India has much more information. If you look at the national health profile, every year they look at it. What is the installed capacity in the country and how much it is produced, who is producing. So if you look at the vaccine technology platforms, except the mRNA vaccines, rest of the technologies are existing in this country. mRNA technology is the new platform which is Moderna and all using. But there are two views about it. One set of people say, oh, it's very complicated. That's a mainstream say. But other set of people say that it is much less complicated vaccine and you can produce in huge numbers. So here I would like to hear from Rohit actually. What do you think about the new vaccine platform technology?
Yeah, I mean, to Malini's question and also to what you're saying, I mean, it does seem that the Indian government is taking three approaches. So there is the sort of indigenous development of vaccines, and that includes even mRNA platforms that may work at higher temperatures, and that could end up being very useful. And also, I know there is one project underway in India for warm vaccines, right? So that could work at 40 degrees Celsius. So all of those things are very important, and it shouldn't be surprising that a lot of the vaccines being developed elsewhere aren't necessarily thinking through these issues. So it is important that they're standing up some domestic approaches to research and development that otherwise aren't being prioritized elsewhere because it's not seen as important. There are, I think the AstraZeneca vaccine and Novavax vaccine are the best examples of vaccines from outside that are coming into India and that are being produced domestically. I think the question is really whether or not India is going to import any vaccine. So, and there's been some talk about the Moderna, but also the Russian vaccine potentially coming into India. And I think there's a legitimate question as to whether or not the government should be doing that as a way of mitigating risk. I do think it's really important to be building the mRNA platforms. I was just in a conversation this morning that if this really is working, the mRNA platforms, it's also potentially a big step change for cancer treatment or for prevention of cancer and even, I guess, potentially treatment. And so that's why Moderna is protecting its platform so heavily, of course, is that they're not going to want to share that. from the outside, actually, the big question that I think is going to come is eventually how much of India's supply is going to leave the country. So I'm actually seeing it in the other way, which is people are raising concerns that not enough is going to be shared. But I think it's a little bit tone deaf, just given what's occurring in the US and Europe.
So there is some talk, Gopal, which is very recent, I think in one of the recent press, that we will use the COVAX facility for accessing the Moderna vaccine. These are news stories which you don't know the level of authenticity that supports them, but perhaps that is one thing. The second thing is also what is the scope for expanding new manufacture, and that too in the public sector. There are units which are sick, there are units which have a hope of revival. And at some point, there is a strong case for pushing some of these now. And I think there is a need for civil society organizations to have, and to things like Jan Swasthya Abhiyan, to come out with much more concrete, doable things or demands of the government in handling some of this crisis.
That's take us to the another question to all panelists. The question is, why cannot India act on its own? Why the civil society should not mobilize the position no to IP implementation? Manufacturing can be disciplined. Question to the whole panel. Okay, why instead of waiting for the green flag from the WTO, why don't you act of your own? That's the question. And what civil society can do. So that is what Sundar in a way left it there, and so now the same question on the IP front. He was referring to the manufacturing.
Okay, maybe I'll start this off. I think it's a great question, Dinesh, but I think the reality of where we are today is that our companies have already been chastened. Okay, they've gone from being the bad boys of the generic, or the not boys, the bad persons of the generic world, to now being tamed into waiting for voluntary licenses, into waiting for permission. I think we were in a totally different space earlier where government, civil society, generic companies were willing to take on the system together. And I think we need to recognize the reality of where we are today, where the companies are sitting back and saying, we don't want to take these risks. We don't think the government is behind us. And so we wait and see what comes our way. And so that's why, Bangladesh producing remdesivir, even before the Indian companies did, that was quite something, and maybe we need that with the vaccines as well. I agree with you that I think we need to build nationally the idea back of sovereignty and self-sufficiency in these areas, because we can see what a catastrophe it is because of what we have done. We have to also focus on global solidarity, as Rohit has pointed out. The reality is so many countries who are relying on remdesivir to come from India, we are not making enough for ourselves. Where is the question of export? And the same thing is going to happen with the vaccines. So I agree. I think national capacity, the idea of national, a national project coming back on local production, on medicines, on vaccines, but we have to tie it with global solidarity, because that is the reality of an international pandemic. And it's shown us what happens when you fragment countries, when you fragment industry like this. So not necessarily the answer that you're looking for, but I agree. I think we need to build pressure both on the companies and the governments, but we should acknowledge what a difficult and different situation we are in today than we were in 20 years ago.
This is the sort of a pending question when all panelists can answer, but I'll request Rohit to start and then followed up with by all the panelists. So you have written about the role of Gates Foundation in the whole thing, and you also work in the on an alternative R&D model where you have referred on public funding on research. There are AMC as a method to sort of finance. So all those things have happened, but we are not seeing a deal engage from the prices of the product, from the R&D cost, or a new way to look at the medical product. That's not happening. But rest of all those groups advocated, to reform the R&D architecture happened. So who is basically controlling the agenda? Is it the pharma industry, or is the Gates Foundation, or is what's happening actually, or is it the last effort to maintain the status quo? When people also mentioned that it's kind of an effort to maintain the status quo.
There's no easy answer, but I think there's probably maybe I should say three things that are occurring. So there's an ideology that I think existed and sort of existed uncomfortably alongside one that was sort of pushing for more public approaches or delinked approaches. And sort of we all knew that there was this other way that the Gates Foundation and others supported that kind of was uncomfortably coexisting with what we were pushing for. But what has happened with the pandemic is, in the pressure of very little time and very little transparency and very little access to policymakers and to information, you're going to get the sort of the approach that's easiest for companies and for very few governments and foundations to put together. I think the second thing is the idea of delinkage in some ways was never really to challenge, at least at the front end. I think for a lot of us it is, but the way we've always been trying to do it is to say, you know, here are things that we know industry doesn't care about. So let's just try to focus on these things right now and try to get these delinked models off the ground. But with COVID, it's global all at once. And so I think the challenge has been, it's very easy then to sweep aside the models that we've been pushing for and to only sort of make use of what industry is pushing for. And I think that goes to the last thing, which is industry, because of everything that's occurred before, because we've disinvested in the public sector, because we haven't set precedent for how agreements should be signed, they are sort of holding all of the cards and all of the power. So even if they're not exercising it explicitly, there's sort of this understanding that unless sort of everything is done to make industry feel comfortable, because of the situation everyone is in, and because there's so little time to respond, we're not going to get the response we want. So I think a lot of governments just feel like they're not in a situation or a moment in which they can challenge industry. I think that also goes to why these second and third generation vaccines are so important to focus upon, to point out what's not occurring and to also just say, everyone's attention is being focused on these first vaccines coming out onto the market. Let's get things right with the second and third generation where we know that we can start showing what the right approaches are.
And the treatments as well. I think we're just not focusing on the therapeutics, but the reality is that that's going to be equally important. So you're right. I think there's a 6-month action plan, and I think there's then what actually comes after that, which is going to be even more important, frankly.
So Sundar, any last parting shot, or put it in another way, as a civil society as well as concerned citizens, what should we do at the international and national level, at least from a activism perspective?
We always complained as civil society that there was not enough attention being paid to health. Now with the vengeance, everybody is forced to pay attention to nothing else. We are on to health. The question is how far we are able to steer the discussion, how far we are able to set the terms of that. I think we need to move out into other policy making circles, into other decision areas, to be able to influence discussion in a larger set of circles on many of these things. Between us, there are fine-tuned differences. But we do need an active way in which to do that. But this is an occasion to do it. If you don't do it now in the midst of a pandemic, when some of these issues are far back, I mean, they go back 15 years, 20 years. But this is an occasion that we have to actually increase there is a public attention to these issues. And this is therefore the time to be able to take this much wider into the discussion. I'm not too hopeful of the government per se, which interest is at the geopolitical level becoming a junior partner of the US. Without a certain anti-imperialist urge, without a certain nature of sovereignty vis-a-vis the imperial powers, you're not going to be able to get very radical change there. But still, because of the crisis and the force that you have to respond to the crisis, we can engage in this discussion, which will set the stage for change. I think Rohit's point that we should really focus a lot upon the inadequacies of the first generation of vaccines and what we need to do at least within the next 12 to 18 months would be a good way to take the discussion. We have a plan immediate. We have one for waiver that you have to do by December. And then you have something that for the next 6 months that we are talking of. And then you have something for the next 18 months that we are talking of. So there are innovative and creative ways in which we should keep this discussion much more central to their public discourse.
Rajam?
Yeah, no, it's just when Sundar talked about public discourse that I think it's something that we really have to think about, which is the narrative and influencing it. I think we have to point out the absurdity of having a people's vaccine campaign in this moment. It is absurd that we're having to ask for it. It is absurd that we're having to make the point that this is something that should not even be a debate. So look at how far off our understanding of whether it's rights or entitlements, accountability has come, that it's taking multiple international organizations and civil society groups to say that this is a legitimate demand. And that is what our effort has gone into for the last 6 months. And frankly, that's not where our effort should have gone into. So I think we really have to focus on this public narrative and recognize how entrenched it has become, the necessity of big pharma, and that we cannot do anything to upset them because, then they're not going to give us the drugs or the vaccines that we need. That the accountability of government is also tied into what the corporate sector does and what the private sector does. And that community groups and civil society don't have a space in these rooms and don't have expertise. I think that to me is one of the most shocking things that has come out of this. The expertise actually lies here. Whether it's about vaccines, about medicines, or even about health structures. So I think the narrative is something that we really need to work on and focus on and recognize that we have actually missed a little bit over there. As I was telling someone, I said that I even somebody as cynical as me thought that, when there is an actual pandemic, all these questions on IP and what you do, this will just not be a question. After all, Big Pharma has been saying that to us for years. Don't use compulsory license until it's the last resort, until it's absolutely necessary. And look at where we are. So I think we thought we had certain wins. It seems they are much more fragile than we thought they would be. But not to end on a negative note, I think I want to support what both Sundar and Rohit and Gopa and Veena have also said, that I think there's such a strong core of civil society and public health groups that are working on this, and we really need to build on that and take this forward. I think there's a real opportunity here, and we just cannot afford to miss it. So.
The broad point which is coming out is again and again is the role of the state on either its own investment in R&D as well as investment in manufacturing of these facilities. And also, I think we, in the coming days, the groups in India also should look at India, and government has submitted a waiver proposal, but it should also act at the domestic level, not wait for the Geneva and green flag from Geneva. And lastly, I would say that we should also seriously look into this relation between the trade secrets and the regulatory linkage. So this is kind of a pattern linkage, seems like. But I think we need to have a regulatory reform urgently to facilitate a abbreviated regulatory pathway for a non-originator vaccine too. I think these are the areas I think we should work in the coming days as a civil society, academic experts, and concerned citizens.